In the autumn of 1941, the men who ruled the Japanese Empire had talked themselves into a single comforting idea. America was rich, but America was soft. Its people loved comfort more than sacrifice. Faced with a hard war across the Pacific, the United States would surely bargain rather than bleed. This was the settled belief in Tokyo. It was the belief that carried Japan toward war. One man kept telling them they were wrong. He had studied at Harvard University. He had crossed America by train and seen its steel mills and its oil fields with his own eyes. He had served 2 tours as a naval officer in the United States, and he warned, again and again, that a long war with the Americans could end only one way. It would end in Japan's defeat. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Here is the paradox that makes him one of the most haunting figures of the entire war. The admiral who was most certain Japan would lose was the very same admiral who designed the attack that began the war. He opposed the fight, he predicted the ruin, and then he built the most daring opening blow in the history of naval warfare. American commanders came to fear him above every other Japanese officer, and his own private doubts never left him for a single day. So how did a man who expected defeat become the mastermind behind Japan's greatest victories? Let us take a closer look at Yamamoto's 3 greatest tactical moves of the Second World War. To understand the first move, you first have to understand the man. He was born in 1884 in the town of Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture, the son of a poor former samurai. As a young officer, he fought at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where an explosion tore 2 fingers from his left hand. For the rest of his life, he wore white gloves in public to hide the missing fingers. In the pleasure houses of Japan, the geisha gave him a teasing nickname. They called him 80 sen, because a full manicure of 10 fingers cost 100 sen, and Yamamoto had only 8 fingers left to tend. He was, above all things, a gambler. At Harvard, he became a fanatical poker player who would stay up through the night winning hand after hand, and he used his winnings to travel across the United States and study the country up close. He loved bridge and chess and long odds, and he once boasted that if he were set loose for a year, he could earn his living at the gaming tables of Monte Carlo. That gambler's nerve would one day let him stake an empire on a single throw, but the same journeys that sharpened his nerve also opened his eyes. Japan made only a fraction of America's steel and almost none of its oil. In a long war of factory against factory, Japan would simply be ground into dust. That knowledge made him dangerous, and it made him a target. As Deputy Navy Minister in the late 1930s, Yamamoto argued openly against war with the United States and against the alliance with Nazi Germany. He warned that America was not the weak-willed nation his colleagues imagined. To those who spoke lightly of beating the United States, he gave a chilling answer. To truly win, he said, Japan would have to march all the way to Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House itself. He knew perfectly well that no such thing could ever happen. It was his blunt way of saying the war was already lost. Ultranationalists sent him death threats and plotted to kill him. In August 1939, the Navy moved him to command the fleet at sea, partly to place him beyond the reach of the assassins in the capital. Yamamoto expected to die by violence. He only meant to choose the manner of it. For decades, Japanese naval strategy had rested on one patient idea. Japan would wait. It would let the American fleet steam west across the Pacific, wear it down along the way, and destroy it in one great decisive battle in home waters. Wait and react. Yamamoto rejected that plan completely. He would not wait for the Americans to come to him. He would cross the ocean first and strike the United States Pacific Fleet, where it lay at anchor, in Hawaii, on the opening morning of the war. The Naval General Staff was horrified. The plan was reckless, they said, a gamble that risked the Empire's finest carriers on a single roll of the dice. Yamamoto answered with the one weapon that could move them. In October 1941, he made it known that if the attack was not approved, he and his entire staff would resign. Japan could not go to war without him, and the objections collapsed. The gamble was on. Then came the preparation, and it was relentless. Pearl Harbor was barely 40 feet deep, far too shallow for standard aircraft torpedoes, which would dive into the mud on release. Only in the autumn of 1941 did Japanese engineers solve the problem, fitting their torpedoes with wooden fins that broke away as the weapon hit the water, so it would run true in the shallows. The modified torpedoes reached the fleet dangerously late. Air crews trained in secret for months against a stretch of coast chosen because it resembled Hawaii. A Japanese agent in Honolulu quietly reported which ships tied up where. Planners studied the British carrier raid on the Italian fleet at Taranto for every lesson it held. And Yamamoto's staff officer, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, drafted the operational plan that gathered 6 aircraft carriers into one striking fist: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, and the Zuikaku. No navy on Earth had ever massed that much carrier air power in a single force. On November 26, 1941, that fleet slipped out of a lonely bay in the Kuril Islands and vanished into the empty North Pacific. It held strict radio silence, took the stormy northern route where no shipping sailed, and refueled at sea in weather that stayed just calm enough. If the fleet were spotted on the way, the whole plan would fall apart, and Japan would have shown its hand for nothing. Yamamoto was wagering the heart of his navy that it would cross more than 3,000 miles of ocean unseen. Its tactical commander was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The air plan belonged to Commander Minoru Genda. The strike would be led into the sky by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. The order to proceed came as a coded phrase: "Climb Mount Niitaka." At dawn on December 7, 1941, the carriers turned into the wind and launched. 353 aircraft came off the decks in 2 waves, the first of them about 183 planes crossing the coast near 7:55 in the morning. Fuchida radioed back the signal that told the fleet that complete surprise had been won. Below him, the American battle line sat moored in a neat row. Within 2 hours, 8 American battleships were hit, and 4 were sunk outright, among them the Arizona and the Oklahoma. Nearly 200 American aircraft were wrecked on the ground. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. On the Arizona alone, one single ship, more than 1,100 men died. Japanese losses were astonishingly light: 29 aircraft and a handful of midget submarines. The strike was meant to begin only after Japan had formally broken off relations, but the long message to Washington was decoded and typed out too slowly, and it arrived late. The bombs fell on a nation still officially at peace. That single failure turned a surprise attack into what Americans would forever call a day of infamy, and it hardened their fury into something Yamamoto had feared more than any fleet. By any tactical measure, it was a triumph. And yet the victory was hollow at its very center. The prize Yamamoto wanted most was not there. The American aircraft carriers were away at sea, and they came through untouched. The great tanks that held the fleet's fuel oil were left standing. The repair shops and the dry docks that would raise the sunken battleships and mend them were never struck, because Nagumo, uneasy about the missing carriers and the fuel in his own ships, refused to launch a third wave. Admiral Chester Nimitz later judged that leaving that oil intact may have spared the Americans 2 full years of war. Yamamoto grasped the danger at once. While his staff drank and celebrated, he sank into a dark and solitary mood. In a letter that January, he wrote that a warrior could take no pride in striking a sleeping enemy, and that the enemy, once awakened and enraged, would come back with grim determination. There, in that first move, the pattern of the whole man is already plain. He gathered his carriers into one overwhelming fist. He gambled everything on surprise, and above all, he reached for a single knockout blow, one stroke meant to win the war before the weight of American industry could ever be brought to bear. Those 3 instincts shaped every battle he ever fought. 2 of them would make him a legend. The third would destroy him. Before we come to the move that undid him, if you are enjoying this kind of detailed tactical breakdown, do consider subscribing. because there is a great deal more like this on the way. For a few short months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's fleet did exactly what he had promised it would do. It ran wild. This is the second move, and it was a different kind of blow entirely. Pearl Harbor had been a surprise dagger thrust into a sleeping harbor. What came next was raw dominance in the open ocean. Yamamoto did not pause to consolidate his gains. He turned his carriers loose, and in the spring of 1942, he sent Nagumo's striking force west into the Indian Ocean to shatter British sea power in Asia and drive the Royal Navy out of the region for good. The fleet that sailed in late March 1942 was the most experienced carrier force in the world, and it went hunting. On Easter Sunday, April 5, 1942, Fuchida led a strike against the harbour at Colombo on the island of Ceylon. Later that same day, Japanese dive bombers found two British heavy cruisers, the Cornwall and the Dorsetshire, alone at sea and without air cover. What followed was a display of skill few navies could match. More than 8 of every 10 bombs the air crews dropped struck home. Both cruisers went down within minutes, and more than 1,000 of their crewmen were left in the water to be gathered up by a British ship the following day. 4 days later, on April 9, the carriers struck the port of Trincomalee and caught the British aircraft carrier Hermes at sea, undefended. Hermes was the first ship in the world ever built from the keel up as an aircraft carrier. She was sent to the bottom, along with an Australian destroyer at her side. Winston Churchill never forgot those weeks. He later called this the most dangerous moment of the entire war, and the one that alarmed him most, because the fall of Ceylon would have thrown open the whole Indian Ocean to Japan and joined the war in Asia to the war in the West. For a moment, the door stood wide open. It was the British commander, Admiral James Somerville, who quietly saved his fleet, pulling his main force back to a secret anchorage in the Maldive Islands before the Japanese could find it. But look closely, and the cost is there again, sharper than at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had won command of the sea, yet he had not destroyed the enemy fleet. Once more the ships were sunk, and the harbors were burned, and once more the enemy slipped away to fight another day. Worse, these easy victories bred a poison inside the Japanese Navy, a swagger its own officers would later call the victory disease. Men began to believe their carriers simply could not be beaten. Then, on April 18, 1942, came the shock that changed everything. 16 American bombers, launched from a carrier far out at sea, appeared over Tokyo in broad daylight and dropped their bombs on the Japanese capital. The physical damage was slight. The blow to Japanese pride was enormous. The home islands, and the emperor himself, had been shown to be within reach. For Yamamoto, the raid dissolved the last doubts in the high command. Japan had to find and destroy the American carriers at once, in the decisive battle he had always craved. His chosen bait was a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. The pattern had held. He was once again reaching for the single knockout blow. That reach carried him to the third move, and to disaster. The plan for Midway was the fullest expression of everything Yamamoto believed. He would seize the atoll, force the outnumbered American carriers to rush out and defend it, and annihilate them in one grand engagement. It was the decisive battle doctrine of his whole career, made real at last. Yet in reaching for it, he betrayed his own best instincts. The plan was enormously complicated, and it scattered his ships across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. He sent a whole force north to raid the Aleutian Islands as a diversion. He kept his own mighty battleships, and himself aboard the flagship Yamato, far behind the carriers, too distant to help them when the crisis came. The fleet that had triumphed by concentration now went into battle divided. The warning signs were already there. In a war game rehearsing the operation, an umpire ruled that American bombers had caught the carriers by surprise and sunk 2 of them. A senior officer on Yamamoto's staff simply overruled him, slashing the number of hits so that the flagship Akagi was restored to the game and sailed on as if nothing had happened. No one wanted to look too closely at the danger, and this time the Americans were not asleep. In a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, A team of codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to know a great operation was coming. Rochefort was famous for working around the clock in a bathrobe and slippers, and he suspected the target, known in the intercepts only by the letters AF, was Midway. To be certain, the Americans had Midway broadcast a message in plain language, reporting that its fresh water plant had failed. Soon a Japanese signal was intercepted, noting that the target was short of fresh water. The trap was confirmed. Nimitz's intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, went further still. He predicted almost the exact hour, distance, and compass bearing from which the Japanese carriers would appear, and when the day came, he proved right to within about 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes. Nimitz did not walk into Yamamoto's ambush. He laid one of his own, hiding 3 American carriers northeast of the atoll, and waited. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Nagumo's carriers launched their strike against Midway, still believing no American ships were near. Then came word that an American fleet was, in fact, close by. Nagumo hesitated over a terrible choice, whether to rearm his aircraft to hit the ships or to finish the job on the island, and while he wavered, his flight decks filled with fueled and armed planes. The first American attacks came in low, from the torpedo squadrons, and they were slaughtered. One squadron from the carrier Hornet lost all 15 of its aircraft, and of 30 men only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating alone in the sea and watching the battle turn around him. But those doomed torpedo runs had dragged the defending Japanese fighters down to the waves. High above, the sky was left wide open. At about 20 minutes past 10, American dive bombers plunged out of the sun, unopposed, onto carriers packed with fuel and bombs. Their leaders, Wade McCluskey and Richard Best and Maxwell Leslie, would be remembered ever after. In roughly 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were turned into blazing wrecks. The 4th was hunted down and sunk that afternoon. The reckoning was total. Japan lost all 4 of the fleet carriers in the battle. The pride of the Navy, the very ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. More than 3,000 of her sailors and airmen were killed, and among them was a corps of veteran pilots and mechanics that Japan could never replace. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown and the destroyer Haman, and about 300 men. Far to the rear aboard the Yamato, Yamamoto received the reports in silence, then ordered the retreat. The same hunger for one decisive blow that had won him Pearl Harbor had now led his finest fleet straight into an ambush and destroyed it. 6 months, almost to the day, after the war began, the tide of the Pacific had turned, exactly as the man who planned its opening had feared it would. Which brings us, at the last, to the reckoning of the man himself, and to the strange justice in how his story closed. Yamamoto did not fall in a great sea battle. He was killed by the very weapon that had beaten him at Midway, the American mastery of his own secret codes. In April 1943, American codebreakers decrypted a message that gave the exact schedule of an inspection flight the Admiral was about to make over the Solomon Islands. Nimitz approved the mission himself. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 long-range P-38 fighters set out low across the water, and 16 of them reached the point of interception at almost the precise minute. They shot Yamamoto's bomber down into the jungle of Bougainville. The pilot most historians credit with the kill was Lieutenant Rex Barber, though the honor was argued over for decades. It was a stunning feat, and the Japanese never once suspected that their cipher had been read. Yamamoto died 1 year to the day after the raid on Tokyo that had pushed him toward Midway. The intelligence war he had lost had reached out and found him. Command of the combined fleet passed to another, and the long war of attrition that Yamamoto had always dreaded now began in earnest, island by island and ship by ship. The blow to Japan was so grave that his death was kept secret for weeks and revealed to the nation only in May 1943. He was raised, after death, to the highest rank in the Navy and honored with a rare state funeral in Tokyo that summer. His countrymen mourned him as a hero, Yet history has struggled to grade him ever since, and the honest verdict is a divided one. He was a true innovator who understood carrier air power more clearly than almost anyone of his age, and he carried out the boldest naval stroke ever attempted. Yet the naval historian Jonathan Parshall, weighing the commanders at Midway, concluded that Nimitz earned top marks while Yamamoto earned something close to a failing grade, faulting the tangled, overreaching plan that split his forces in front of a dangerous foe. Both judgments are true at once. That contradiction is the whole of the man. And so we return to where we began, to the comfortable belief in Tokyo that America would never truly fight. The deepest irony of Isoroku Yamamoto is that he never shared that belief, not for a single moment. He knew. He had seen the factories and counted the barrels of oil. He had told his own government that Japan might run wild for 6 months, or perhaps a year, and then the sheer weight of America would grind it down. He was handed the task of opening a war he was certain could not be won, and he carried it out with more brilliance than anyone had thought possible, and the calendar proved his grim prophecy almost to the day. He did not live to see the surrender he had foreseen, but no man in Japan had seen it coming more clearly than the admiral who fired the opening shot. Thank you for watching. What do you think was Yamamoto's most brilliant move, and which commander should I cover next? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoy this kind of history, why not subscribe?